Thank you. Now, tonight's Active Travel Cafe, we will start as usual with our roundup of crowdsourced news. So please get your thinking caps on for anything you'd like to share. And we'll run that for about 15-20 minutes. And then our main speaker tonight, we are hoping to welcome award-winning environmental journalist Roger Harrabin, who was the former BBC environmental analyst and worked there for many years. We're just having trouble getting Roger joining at the moment, so hopefully that will all be resolved soon. And that gives us time in the meantime to dive into the news. So let's do that straight away. So has anyone got any news to share? There's been quite a lot of stuff happening, good and bad. Over to you guys. Ruth.
I always like to get the party started. It's not really news, but I've just been cycling in Pembrokeshire last week, and to quote LP Hartley, Wales is a different country. They do things differently there. The driving was impeccable. No one tailgated us, close past us, everything. Quiet country roads, no one drove very fast at us. And I couldn't understand all the furore about the 20-mile-an-hour limits, because it seemed to me that they worked very well where they were placed. All the drivers seemed to obey them. And there are plenty of 30 and 40 and 50 and 70 and everything. So I think we should be like the Welsh and definitely copy their driving habits. Thank you.
I can't
Sorry,
really...
I'm on mute. Thanks for that, Ruth. Good to know. I've just posted a link in the chat for anyone who didn't see it or notice. It was World Bicycle Day yesterday, and an interesting post there from Lou Hay. Over to you, Brendan.
Yes, I've mentioned this some weeks and months ago, but the Edinburgh Bike Festival is on at the moment, and I've organised a meeting on Sunday, which is going to be streamed, about the question of larger bikes. It's actually got quite a clickbaity title: Beer Bike Bust. What was it? Beer Bike Bust, Reject or Embrace Larger Bikes, something like that. I will put the URL to the page in the chat, and a day or two before the event, it's going to be the streaming link is going to be there, and there's going to be speakers from all sorts of different perspectives, Cycling UK, Cycling Lawyer, and so on, and hopefully an operator of larger bikes. But don't believe that it's just about beer bikes; it's about cargo bikes and everything larger. I think a lot of you will be very interested in it.
Brendan, I just lost you. I don't know about anyone else at the very beginning. What was the title of the talk?
I'll put the URL in the chat, but it's called, I think it's called Beer Bike Bust. There was one seized in Edinburgh, something like Embrace or Reject them. But you'll see, just click the URL and you'll see. And it's on Sunday at 4.
Whereabouts?
It'll be streamed online. It's actually in Edinburgh if you're around.
Okay.
But it'll be
in Edinburgh. Brilliant. Thank you. Adam, over to you.
Yeah, this one's it's an unusual one. I've been trying to understand the city region sustainable transport settlements, the burn rate on that money. So if anybody's not aware of it, the metro areas have been allocated 5.8 billion in money. In the case of, I can look at WECA, they got 540 million with an uplift from councils of around about 20% contribution, which brings up to about 617 million. They've spent probably around about 20 million up to now. They got 2 years and 9 months to try and spend another 600 million, which works out at £200 per head per year for now. Now, I don't know if anybody else is ever done anything with councils, but that level of spending is almost impossible to achieve. So the city region sustainable transport settlement, I know that the current government announced a 8.9 billion version 2 that starts in 2027, but I suspect the new Labour government, when that comes in, will come up with a different thing, and this will be the last of it. So if you're not on top of your combined authority and the leadership inside that, trying to get them to understand the burn rate that they're not achieving to spend all that money, they're going to lose. I suspect you'll lose all of that huge amounts. And I suspect what we'll see is around about 2 to 3 billion of that money being returned back into government. So if you're in a combined authority or metro area, this is probably one of the most critical things you can focus on. That's in terms of money and capability of building out cycle infrastructure and walking, wheeling, and bus infrastructure.
Thanks, Adam. Brendan, did you want to come back in, or is your hand just left hanging up there? I think it might be. I will put it down. Colin, over to you in Ealing.
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to talk about the DFT's consultation on allowing motorbikes in bus lanes as the default position, which ends at the end of this week. It's been going since March. I should have got onto this sooner. In 2010, TfL ran a trial which produced 2 statistically significant results comparing the bus lanes that motorbikes were allowed in and those that they weren't. One of which was an increase in motorcyclist casualties and the other was an increase in cyclist casualties. They explained away the increase in cycling casualties on the grounds that the cyclists weren't actually colliding with motorbikes, but failed to explain what was causing it. And there are various theories. I think the most likely is that cyclists were scared into riding in a less prominent position and were therefore less visible. Anyway, they did a second trial in which they carefully avoided producing comparable results with the first one, and just said, okay, we're going to go ahead and do this. I'm convinced that for those parts of the country, which I think is most of it, where bus lanes are about the best cycling facility you're going to get because there isn't room to have pedestrian, cyclists and buses all separate, in a typical 3-metre wide British bus lane, it's a major deterrent to cycling to have motorcyclists zooming past. It was found, by the way, that motorcycle journey times improved, but it was also found that their speeds increased, not very surprisingly. So if you are in a position to comment on the consultation, either on your own behalf or as an organisation, I'd strongly encourage you to do so. I'll put the URL for the consultation in the chat. And anyone who wants, I can send the reports I did back in 2010 and 2011, explaining what I've just said in more detail.
Thanks, Colin. Does anyone want to say anything about that topic, or should we move on to Ian in Sheffield? If anyone wants to come in on the motorbikes topic.
Yeah, because I was going to talk about this the proposed route in Brighton, where they're proposing a 3.3 metre wide bus lane with no shared with motorbikes and no cycle facility in there, and we're hoping very much to have that headed off. But I was just wondering, if Colin, if you had anything in there about wider bus lanes and narrower bus lanes and any distinction, because obviously there are the sort of pseudo wide bus lanes which are 4.5 meters wide, which have a cycle lane within them, and then there are the narrow ones. So are you saying anything about that?
Trial didn't say anything about that. It didn't mention width at all. In my personal view, you can do the arithmetic as well as I can. 0.5 metre minimum bike from curb, another 1.5 metre bike to overtaking vehicle. Presumably the motorcyclist would like a metre between him and the next lane of traffic, and that gets you to about 4 metres. So yes, over 4 metres, it's probably less of an issue. But it shouldn't be the default, because the default bus lane width is 3.3 or less.
Thank you. Any other comments on motorbikes? Ruth, is yours about the motorbikes?
It's a question, yes.
Yeah, go for it.
Is this can each borough make its own decision, Colin? Or I thought it was a London-wide thing and TfL had decided against them some years back.
The current situation is that each borough can make their own decision, but TfL have decided that they strongly recommend that boroughs do allow motorbikes in and that they do them in their own. But the point is, this DFT consultation is about overruling that, and as far as I can see, it will be very difficult for a borough to go against the rule that they're proposing. You can read the consultation, but it's strongly implied that you would need sort of DFT permission not to have a motorbike permission if you have a bus lane.
That answers the question, Ruth. Yeah. Ian, over to you.
Yeah, it's just reporting a tweet from Louise Haigh, who's the Labour Party Shadow Transport Secretary, and therefore a high chance that she will be the Transport Secretary from July. Basically, she said Labour will support local authorities to provide the safe, accessible cycling infrastructure that is right for their areas, so that everyone who wants to cycle can. No further details. Previously, she's made reasonably positive noises about active travel, but not providing any details. So it's just really for information. I'm sure people have seen the tweets, but she's very likely to be the next Transport Secretary, and she's also an MP for in Sheffield. So it's just for information. Positive, but wait to see the details.
Thanks, Ian. And I think that picture she posted with that tweet was taken in Sheffield, possibly, was it?
Yeah, she had some contact with Cycling UK back in March, so they're hopefully working with her and lobbying her and providing all sorts of useful information.
Thank you. Jill.
Okay, it's just a really silly little thing, but I just wanted to share it. I've got my iPad propped up against my sewing machine, and the reason is very relevant to anyone who is active travel campaigning. We've got a primary school, infant school, that are really proactive in promoting cycling, walking and scooting to school. And I don't know, about last summer term, I ended up with this random conversation where we connected up the fact that all of the children in year 1 and 2 needed to learn to sew buttons on, with the fact that buttons could be wheels. So what we've made is lots of bunting with little bicycles or little scooters, and there's kids have sewn wheels. So I've got 60 of these things to sew together so they can put them up. But as I say, it must be a primary school thing. They must need to learn to sew buttons on. So if you've got a primary school near you that's sewing buttons on, get them to become wheels, and then they can hang it up. And there's lettering on it. It's going to be Woollenwick Infant School wheels, and it'll go up. And they'll, when they do their next procession where they bling their bikes, they decorate their bikes with stickers and bells and ribbons and everything. Yeah, it's just a fun, really positive little thing.
Thank you, Jill. Yeah, but love that, and getting some love in the chat as well. I posted in the chat a minute ago from someone who couldn't be here but has emailed us in about a session being run by Cycling UK, a session on barriers and removing said barriers. So that I know that crops up quite a lot on Active Travel Cafe. So hopefully you can see that in the chat. Does anyone else have any news to share? And I must at this point say that we are struggling to get Roger Harabin on the webinar at this point. So I'm gonna check in with one of our assistants behind the scenes and see if we manage to get him yet. But as it stands, if we don't, we'll have to cut the session short and see what's going on and whether we can get him to a future session. So if anyone's got any other items to share, I will open the floor. Mark.
Yeah, so there was a report this week or last week from Lyme in conjunction with Centre for London, and this refers mainly to London, but it will affect everyone else, about what to do about dockless bikes or Lyme style bikes across London, and concentrating on trying to regularise. I mean, Ruth mentioned earlier about borough by borough approach, and what they're trying to do is get rid of a borough by borough approach to having something more consistent across certainly London and large conurbations, and this really does, Adam was mentioning about CRCS, really only affects those sort of places. So maybe London, Birmingham, Manchester are probably the three areas, or West Midlands, that probably the three areas that are relevant. But it'd be interesting to see how that develops in future and what maybe comes back after the election. If anyone was there, it'd be interesting to hear from them who was at that launch. Sounds like no one was.
Anyone there? Was anyone there? No. So a bit more chat about the Louise Hay tweet in the chat, and I did actually see the exact same wording posted on a couple more Labour MP accounts. So it's obviously some sort of, the line was obviously a sort of an agreed line in terms of how she spoke to that. Okay, anyone else want to come in?
I don't know how I get my the icon hand up, but I've
James,
yeah.
Apologies for not seeing the actual hands.
Sorry, my apologies for not working out how to put an icon hand. Just comments on bus lanes and PSPOs. Firstly, a word of warning about bus lanes. We had this kind of really stupid, allowance of the motorbikes would have been about 2014, and the petrol-headed logic was, well, the NHS blood bikes can use them, therefore we should let all motorbikes use them. It's kind of like some of the logic for taxis. Well, some taxis carry disabled people, so we should allow all taxis. We then ended up 2 years later, they just removed all the bus lanes. So I think it's got to be worth fighting for every little detail on this. If there's only 2 or 3 days left, then definitely I think there's a link there, but definitely it's worth following that. Is it okay to bring on the PSPO issue now, or because it is kind of the same thing? Coventry City Centre, as you may know, has a PSPO, which it again probably goes back to about 2018. They were initially talking about a so-called cycle ban. If any of you know, the precinct itself has never allowed cycling. The first PSPO I think was pretty weak. I don't think it had any impact. To be honest with you, I don't think any signs went up. I don't think much really happened. And then late last year, we're doing that in November, they brought in this one which essentially was to ban e-bikes. And of course, they've never really understood the difference between a pedelec and these much less legal or illegal, what are basically unlicensed e-motorbikes. And I was cycling through the city centre late last week. And now I technically have a protected characteristic. So I was on an e-bike, and according to the PSPO, I have every right to be there. Except, of course, as far as I'm concerned, I don't think the council should have any, I don't think they should be able to stop me. I think that's a gross intrusion. I don't see why I should have to justify being there. So I'm quite happy. I'll take a ticket. That to me is the only way to fight this. But there was basically what I saw was a police van, and they were actually telling a regular cyclist that they can't cycle through the Coventry precinct. And this is a prime route. This is basically the flagship of Coventry routes, right through Broadgate, right through the city centre. The signing's always been ambiguous, but according to the police, cycling in a regular pedal bike is just as illegal as what the PSPO said, which is no e-bikes. So I really hope we can get some kind of challenge to this. I'm just seeing in the chat people asking, what is a PSPO? Well, yes, it's basically a local bylaw. That's probably the easiest thing to describe it. But we have really a city that, for want of a better word, is extremely bipolar at the moment in terms of what they're doing. They're rightly praised for doing some very good new cycle routes, and you can basically, there is a route you can take which is east to west through the city, and this is very close to Dutch cycling standards. And then we have rubbish in the city centre where legally you're allowed to cycle on an e-bike if you've got a protected characteristic. That's very grey area for those who are familiar with the Equality Act. It's very grey what they mean by that. Do they just mean people with a disability, or do they mean people with any protected characteristics, such as parents with kids in a freight bike? This hasn't been tested, and it needs to be tested. And you know, so at the moment we have this kind of complete mess of dual provision. Anyway, I think that's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Sorry, Adam, I couldn't unmute myself. Adam,
Okay.
to you.
As it hasn't been mentioned already, that people may be aware of the Exeter Heavy Tree low traffic neighbourhood. That went into a meeting yesterday where they decided to abandon it. What was interesting about it, they used an equalities impact assessment as an approach to basically justify closing, stopping. However, during the meeting, when there was a request to look at road danger reduction and road safety, that was disallowed, and that information wasn't allowed to be part of the meeting. So I don't know where that puts that, because other equality impact assessments on low traffic neighborhoods have always come out with, for some it's beneficial, for some it's negative, but not having the road safety officer in the room, or even a report about what the impact would be on removing the LTN and allowing 11,000 vehicles back into those residential areas. That side of it, I think needs to play out properly somewhere, and I don't know where that will end up playing out. But if they're starting to say that, you know, congestion is disabled discrimination effectively, then I think we're in some very, very weird grey areas. I don't know if anybody's got any thoughts on that.
While anyone's thinking whether they've got some thoughts, so at this point I'm going to have to give the bad news that unfortunately we've not been able to get Roger into the webinar this week, so we're going to have to line Roger Harrabin up for another session. So instead we're just going to go with a presentation that Mark Philpotts, our regular Renty Highwayman, was going to do later, but we'll move it up the pecking order. And so Mark is on the call now. So apologies if you've joined to hear Roger, and no offence if you tune off. And we will get Roger on another time. So over to you, Mark. And if anyone wanted to come in on Adam's point, I'm sure we could do that while Mark's just getting his slides up. Mark, over to you.
Could somebody let me share, please?
Yes, hang on a moment.
We'll make this as slick as we can.
Your sound is a bit ropey, Mark.
I've got the thing on my head, that's why. There we go, that's better.
Yeah,
Right.
you can share now.
Okay, give me 2 seconds. So we're going to try and share. So this is completely unprepared, so bear with me.
Completely unprepared says flashing up with loads of very organised slides.
Right, we're there. Well, this is a good one, because I haven't given this lecture for some time, and I've just been very quickly editing some stuff out of it. But let's see we go. This was actually designed to be given to civil engineering graduates and students. But don't let that put you off. I'll explain some of the bits and pieces as we go. But this will be quite interesting around why people are scared about innovation and doing things differently and everything else. So hopefully we'll pull it out the bag, and this will give us something good to talk about. So let's jump in and see where we get to. So let me explain this. We have something in the civil engineering, well, in the engineering world, the construction world, the Construction Design and Management Regulations 2015. You don't need to know what they are or how they work, but essentially it's a piece of legislation that's to do with managing design construction safely. I won't go into the detail, but just hold that into your head for a second. Perhaps the more important question is from a designer's point of view, how do we hold, or how is a designer held accountable for what they do? So under what law can a designer be held liable for anything they do? How likely is it for somebody to be sued? And all those interesting things. So let's just start off. So it's about the designers. We've got this piece of legislation in the background that watches over the likes of people like me. So the first thing to have a little think about is what is the difference between laws, standards, and guidance? This would be a question in a room full of students that I throw the open to the floor and get people to shout answers out. A bit difficult to do that online. So I shall go straight in and give you some definitions here. So we have laws, and on the left there is the Road Traffic Regulation Act, which is a piece of primary legislation that gives all sorts of interesting things to highways, to the police for enforcement and other things. But essentially, they give duties and powers. It gives the ability to fulfill those duties. And if we don't follow the law, we're in trouble from a criminal point of view or a civil point of view. We then have standards, and that prescribes how things should be done, and that's about ensuring consistency. And then we have guidance, and that's potentially on how we achieve the other two. Not always necessarily, but there's a bit of a blurring going on there. So we often see people talking about, oh, this needs to be designed to a particular standard. Quite often they mean guidance. So Local Transport Note 120, which is about cycle infrastructure design, that's guidance, that's not a standard. Confused you will be. So I've mentioned the construction design and management regulations. So they are regulations, they are secondary legislation. So Acts of Parliament is primary legislation, regulations are secondary legislation, they're kind of spawned from the first. And from the CDM point of view, this is the thing that designers are interested in. We have the regulations, which are law. We have some legal guidance, which is probably a standard. That's how you actually meet your legal requirements. And also the industry has produced its own guidance, which is very much definitely guidance. Do we have to follow guidance on anything? The answer to that is no. But we can, of course, be prepared to defend ourselves in court if we've done something a bit different. So, as I've mentioned, we've got this enabling legislation, which is the primary stuff, which is acts. We have regulations, which is the secondary stuff, which basically tells us how the first is dealt with. Another set of regulations, a bit more to home for this particular forum. We have the traffic signs regulations and general directions 2016. Otherwise known as the Big Book of Traffic Signs, and that basically tells us what the signs look like, how we use them, how we light them, what layouts do we do, all that kind of thing. We then have the Traffic Signs Manual, which is another set of big books of signs, and that actually takes a rather complicated regulation and sets it out in a bit more detail to try and explain how you actually do things practically. So again, you don't need to know the ins and outs of this, just that they exist. They're quite useful. And I spend all my time going through these books, trying to work out how things should be properly signed and how the road markings should be put together. Then we have, as some might have heard, the Design Manual for Roads and Bridges. Now, this is very much a standard if you're working on a National Highways road or a Scottish Government road or a Welsh Government road. Lots of local authorities like to quote the Design Manual for Roads and Bridges and say, well, we must do things in accordance with that on our roads. They don't. They're basically taking a standard, making that into local guidance. And what you will find is lots of counties especially will cherry pick and they'll say, right, well, you have to do it a certain way because of the Design Manual for Roads and Bridges, up until the point where it's walking and cycling infrastructure, where they'll try and go for the absolute minimum requirement they can find. Again, good to be aware, it is only mandatory on national highways and government roads. Elsewhere, it's only ever guidance. So a little bit around what hazard and risk is. So what's a hazard, what's a risk, and what is health and safety? People band the term around an awful lot. So a hazard essentially is something that could cause harm. A risk is the likelihood of that hazard actually causing harm. And the difference between health and safety, as I would put it, is health will kill you eventually, safety will kill you now. And again, you can just keep that in mind. A bit inflammatory, I know, but it's a good way of trying to remember it. So if we go back to the previous slide here, you could argue that the hazard in this particular photograph is the bus. The risk of the person on the bike getting hit by the bus driver is something you might want to measure in how you design your layout there. The health and safety differences here. So health is about the long-term exposure of that cyclist to traffic fumes. So it will kill you eventually. Safety is the here and now. If that bus driver swerves into the cycle lane when the cyclist is there, that's something that could kill the cyclist. That's the difference between health and safety. Probably a matter of timing, really. So there is a really handy table here. And this goes back over a decade. It's something I use all the time. And this is to try and work out, so what do we think the actual real safety issue is in a particular situation. So what we can do is we can have a look at the likelihood of an event occurring. So if we go back to my example of, let's just go up again, we've got the bus driver, we've got the person cycling in the cycle lane. So if we think about an event happening, so the event happening could be bus driver swerves into the cyclist against that barrier. The actual likelihood, which is on the left-hand side here, the actual likelihood day to day of a bus driver doing that, in that situation, you've got properly painted cycle lane, which isn't fantastic protection, but it still gives people a bit of an instruction on how the road operates. You're probably going to be in the lower scores here, you know, 1 to 3 perhaps. You do have the risk though, if the bus driver does hit the cyclist, what is the consequence of that event happening or that event occurring? And the consequence here is probably going to be into the high severe category. So if we even took it if we took it to be a fairly negligible likelihood, but it's severe, that keeps us in the green. If we're going to get down towards the low, medium, it's going to get very certain when you're down to the 5. Obviously, you go across with the severe consequence, you're into the amber and the red. This is strictly taken from maintenance guidance, but the actual risk assessment process is applicable anywhere. So in this situation, we may actually end ourselves into the, we may be saying it's very low, we may be saying it's high severe, something like that. So it's probably in the amber. There's probably a medium risk here, and we may want to go back and do some design tweaks. If we've got risks in the red, then we probably need to do something fundamental. So having the idea of how risk assessment works, and you may disagree with it, it's down to the individual assessor, and it can often be useful for an independent person. Look at what you're doing. So I did present this a little while ago. This is Gorringe versus Calderdale, and this was the case of the woman who went over a blind summit, thought there was a bus on her side of the road, and she basically moved across and hit the bus. And the outcome of that particular court case was people should take the road as they find it. So there's this general presumption that people are responsible for their own safety. The highway authority has a duty to maintain what's there, but not to warn of dangers. But what about if we have a poor design? So those who've been here for a while would have recognised this particular photo. It's a right-hand bend as we look at it, but we can see a left-hand bend arrow in the distance. So if you see the wrong sign at the wrong time, and you take evasive manoeuvres, you're in the hedge. We've got this one as well, which I've probably covered before. 2-stage cycle crossing here. For the first stage, you're actually looking at the signal on your right-hand side, and you're crossing the second stage, you're looking at the signal on your left-hand side. The problem is you're joining the crossing point to the left, usually. Your eyes will tend to focus into the distance, so I would contend that some people would get to this first crossing and be watching that signal head. If that signal head goes green, but actually that first crossing, people should be not crossing, and you've got a tipper lorry coming from your side, you've let people into a bit of a trap there. That is still like it to this day. It's a really dodgy layout. But if we get into the actual liability from a local authority point of view, and by extension, their consultant, designers, and anyone else involved, most of the claims against local authorities are for maintenance defects. claims against local authorities for design defects, believe it or not, are incredibly rare. And of those, successful claims are even rarer. You really have to search hard to find case law on prosecutions being brought from the Health and Safety Executive, usually for poor highway design. You do get some civil claims, but again, fairly rare, don't often get successful. Even in some situations where you look at it and you think, this is absolutely crazy, how did this not go through? But there you go. So it's trips, falls, potholes, all that kind of stuff. That's where the claims are from a local authority point of view. Doesn't excuse poor design, but it's where most of the issues are for local authorities. We have this particular case, which is interesting, which is King versus DETR. So the DETR was the Department for Environment, Transport and the Regions. That's back in the mid-90s. That's now called the Department for Transport, DFT. And this was a claim from a motorcyclist against a highway authority and the designer of a particular roundabout. I think this was down in Kent. Again, don't worry too much about the technical drawing on the left here. This is really just to show you how terrible UK drivers are, UK roundabouts are. So we've got various angles on how roads going to roundabouts should be set out. And you've got a couple of things here. If people join the roundabout dead on at 90 degrees and they're going too quickly, they have to put the brakes on heavily before they enter the roundabout. If the road comes in nice and gently from an angle, it means that people don't have to slow down and they can join the roundabout at speed. UK design approach tends to have everything nice and wide, nice and easy, so we get high speeds into roundabouts and high speeds out of them, which is a big criticism of how we do it. In that particular case, the roundabout involved was so easy to drive into at speed. King, the guy that made the claim, ended up going right the way through into the middle of the roundabout, through the chevron boards, all that kind of thing, and he was very badly hurt. And what he was contending was the roundabout design wasn't in accordance with the design manual for roads and bridges. Well, that again. It was originally a road built by Department of Environment, Transport and Regions at the time. It was transferred, I think it was Kent County Council, transferred to the County Council. And so the County Council said, well, we didn't design it, it's not down to us. The claim has to be back with the government. And this is where things got very complicated. From memory, I don't have my notes available for this one. I had to try and find this presentation quickly, but it's one of these things that went backwards and forwards, but it is so rare. You just don't hear about these particular cases very often. However, if we go across the North Sea, the Dutch have roundabouts where you are meeting the roundabouts at 90 degrees. You do have to slow down. As drivers, you are pinched between, well, the right-hand side, because we're in the Netherlands, and a nice big island. You have to go around the roundabout very slowly with lots of care. And actually, people do very well with this type of layout. It's very safe layout. From a walking, wheeling, and cycling point of view, you do give way to traffic, but everything is controlled and speeds are nice and slow. That's what we should be doing, not these horror shows. So, interesting thing about the refuge. So we do have a refuge here on the Dutch layout that has to be maintained as we do the rest of the layout. Refuges is something that we have all the time. Here's one from down in Dagenham in London. So from the legislation, construction, design and management regulations point of view, as a designer, I'd have to think, okay, so I'm going to build this refuge to help pedestrians cross the road, but how will the workforce actually maintain that safely? And the stock answer to that is, well, we'll put traffic lights in, or we'll close the road, or do something like that, so the road workers can get at it and clean the bollard or replace the curb or whatever. So we go to that extent of trying to protect the workforce when they're doing some maintenance work on that refuge, but actually we're quite happy for somebody to stand on there with traffic thundering both directions, although not at that time because that direction isn't going anywhere. But there's a bit of a discrepancy here, because as soon as somebody's working on that, that becomes a workplace. If not, normal circumstances, it's not a workplace. So a little fibre of the law there. So the regulations that designers and others have to deal with, it's around generally with the construction of something, the operation, which in the case of the refuge is the maintenance, and then decommissioning, which is taking things out. So here's a nice little quotation about what a designer's role is. So the designer's role tends to be seen around the construction and the management and the removal of things, and perhaps less about the operational side of things when people are actually using it, although that is a really big important consideration. And that's quite interesting from the point of view of innovation. I guess this is a pretty obvious thing as well, that as a designer, you make decisions that affect the safety of other people, whether it's the people maintaining it, the people using it, the people cleaning it, all this kind of thing. So the regulations apply to maintenance. So again, familiar site there with the lane closed, things done to protect the workforce that we probably don't actually do for the users of the highway. So it's not a workplace for the general public. It's interesting. That's why, generally speaking, if somebody's actually driving for work but involved in a collision, that will still tend to be a police matter rather than health and safety executive. There is an argument that the health and safety executive should have an increased remit to include driving for work. But in terms of an actual collision, that will still be with the police. And we have this whole thing about faith in the book. So we've talked about standard guidance and the law. So if we follow the design manual for roads and bridges, which is a standard, does that mean that what we've designed is safe for the end user? The answer is probably no. Anyone can pick up a book and copy a layout in the book, plonk it on the street, and yeah, that's it, job done. Is there, in terms of innovation in local government and consultancy, do people worry about their personal consequences or corporate consequences? So if you do a design and you think you're going to be sued for doing something badly, does that stifle our innovation? I think it probably does. And it's easier to revert to type and not push the boat out with these things. I'm not going to get into the detail of this one, but there is some nice some words in this particular piece of guidance here. So it is commonly thought that responsibility can be avoided by copying guidance or designs. But the thing is, whenever we apply guidance, we are still making a decision as a designer to do something in a certain way. So guidance can only really deal with generalized situations. So if we think about, again, LTM 120, lots and lots of information in there, but it's guidance. It cannot apply to every single possible layout, alternative, issue, context. It's for the designer to actually look at the local context, what's happening, and use their knowledge and skill, hopefully, to come up with one of many answers. So what I would say to people in kind of trying to do something a bit weird and wonderful, so we could be talking about continuous treatments. We could be talking about Dutch-style roundabouts applied in the UK. Let's have a golden thread. So from a design point of view, and this is questions that campaigners can go and ask of designers and local authorities as well. Quite awkward questions because they can rarely get answered. But what's the vision for the project? So has somebody started off saying, right, we want to go and build a thing from here to here, or a cycle route on this corridor, or a whole crop of crossings in the town centre? What's the vision here? Where's this written into the local policy? What's the context? Who have they consulted? You know, why are we going out to do this thing? What's the objective and the purpose of the thing we're going to do? And through the design process, how do we get to a balanced decision? So floating bus stops is an absolute classic in here. We've got lots of objectives going on. We want to make cycling safe, but we want to make sure people that need to be able to get to the bus stop can still do that. Where does the balance lie? There are things we can do, such as quality audit, all sorts of different audits we can do, actually, safety audit and other things. But we can use this process to try and look at where the trade-offs are and where things are balanced, but always going back to review our original vision, our objectives and purposes, so we can get on and do stuff. Who is the design for? Do people ever write them down? I think from a design point of view, people are so interested in getting off into the designing and getting a thing designed up. They don't take that step back to look at the clear objectives, who are we actually designing for, and then measuring ourselves against those objectives. So really, we should be going from a first principles approach to design rather than just picking up and copying what we see in a book. And if I can kind of throw something towards the private sector, developers, engineers, they're potentially some of the worst at doing this, probably because they're not on a particularly big profit margin. They're under pressure, and developers just want to get their planning consent. They don't really take that crucial step back to think about who we're designing for. Quick work example. This is one of the schemes on I led some time ago. This is Angel Way in Romford Town Centre, for those that know this part of London. And what you have here is a one-way street coming towards us from the distance there. Traffic is basically turning right and heading off into that street out to the left. So that's a one-way loop. And then somehow the very end, which is a cul-de-sac, was two-way, with a little bit of an access to a car park. And then somehow we had a two-way, just painted cycle lane on the left-hand side as we look at it. Goodness knows how this was designed in the first place, whether anybody wrote down objectives on who we were trying to design for. That's probably lost in the dim and distant. So it was not legible, it didn't feel safe. You had to run the gauntlet of drivers turning right here, including HGV drivers, and the public realm, let's be honest, is a bit of a mess. So we did set some objectives. There was a big street redevelopment. So I'm looking from the other direction here. All these buildings here knocked down, lots of new residential developments, some commercial, everything else. And the big objective was, let's put in a legible, safer cycle link. Can we put in some sort of continuous footway across that little side road? Can we provide clear space for each transport mode? And that's just what we did. So we had space for driving, drivers coming along here, turning right as we're now looking at giving way to the cycle track, and pedestrians. We've got forgiving curbs in there. We've got some loading designed in, and it's all very slow for drivers. So if we go back and check off our objectives, we've probably met most of our objectives there. Maybe it could be a bit prettier. Maybe we could put some suds in there. But we've got something which, as you look at it, I guess it's old hat now. We've done a lot of this stuff around the country, but at the time it was pushing the boat out in that particular part of London. It was quite unfamiliar for councillors and residents alike. And that's what we've got. It's far less confusing, very clear where people are going. We did clear out an awful lot of car parking there, but you are next to a massive multi-storey car park. So that was fine. And there's me as the guinea pig testing it, and people were giving way to me. So there you go. For those old enough to remember the Gummer hamburger incident, there's me engaged in a bit of that myself. So let's wrap up, because I've been going on for quite a bit here. So yes, the regulations, as I mentioned, we do have to consider the operational point of thing. You know, we're designing stuff for the public. We have to be mindful of their safety and convenience. If we're going to hold a designer accountable, they can point to all the books they like. If they haven't written down their thought process and how they've gone about setting the objectives and everything else, that would put them on shaky ground. But equally, if you want to do something a bit clever, if you have gone through that process, it can be audited. You can then stand up and demonstrate, well, actually, yes, I have thought about this stuff. I have gone through a proper process. And what I've tried to do here is balance all the competing needs so it's safe, accessible, and the rest of it. And there you go. That was a very quick blast through a bit of risk and liability. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Mark. We have got quite a few questions in the chat, and I'm going to start with one actually that was most recently asked from Ruth, which is, don't construction companies have to pay councils when doing construction work when using pavements and parts of the road, and therefore have a duty to make safe space for walking and cycling? This crops up a lot, so I'll start with that one.
Yes to all of that. It's a simple answer. It very much depends on how good the local street works team are, their knowledge and everything else. So I used to work with a street works coordinator who would know about stuff turning up before it even turned up. He was that good. Other parts of the world, contractors, utilities, developers, they do run right. So there is guidance, there is basic things they should do, but you actually need a bit of a policeman breathing down their neck.
Mm. Ruth, do you want to add anything on that? We have got a few other questions to go to, but
no, but thank you for that. But fortunately, because I've done some work with Mike Barrett, I know it, so I do raise it as often as I possibly can, especially Ealing, who kind of ignore it a lot. Colin. But am I allowed to quickly segue into something else?
go on then.
Okay, so Mark, I did mention to you a while ago, so Richmond are just going to put in crossovers, but they have a habit of using tiles, and there's a tiny lip along the whole of the edge of where you would go into the side street from the road, and that lip can take you out because you have to go wide to take it safely. I've asked them constantly to not do that. Surely there's a design guide manual or what we used to call Crow manual or something that could stop them actually doing that, because it's so dangerous. Thank you.
There is nothing for that, surprisingly. We've got, so England has local transport note 1 of 20, as I've just said. We desperately need a walking wheeling version of that. But no, that kind of stuff doesn't often get covered. And I think the problem is, I mean, if you've got something which is a speed hump, like a side entry raised table, something like that, then you can go back to some regulations and point at that. If it's just a straightforward crossover, convention is that'll be between a 15mm and 40mm high curb face, and you're dead right. If you get that at the wrong angle, you're off your bike. But again, even if that goes to a works department who go out, measure something up and order the work, they are still designers. So a designer is anybody that specifies anything, that agrees anything like that. So I've had discussions with councillors who are overstepping the mark and say, well, you're actually turning into a designer there, councillor. So people that, even highways departments who don't think they're actually doing design work, the fact they're specifying a certain way of doing something is design work. I probably need to see a couple of examples, Ruth, to debate that offline with you.
Okay, thank you. Before I come to you, Guy, can I just ask this one, because I think it's kind of related, which is, why is LTN 120 intended to ensure consistency but is published as guidance rather than standard? Could you just cover that one, Mark?
That's a really good question.
And then we'll go to Guy. That was from Cameron Murray. Thank you, Cameron.
Okay, if I go back to the design manual for roads and bridges, because that is a standard as a starting point for a trunk road. The reason that's a standard is because they want all the traffic lanes to be the same width, the same curvature at given speeds, bridges over roads to a certain height, and all this kind of stuff. The problem with what we're talking about generally is we're retrofitting a lot of stuff. So if you had a standard, let's say for argument's sake, if your standard was that all one-way cycle tracks should be 3 meters wide, you're never ever going to fit that in every single situation. So you end up with so much nuance going on here. You'll end up with, you can imagine the flow chart you have trying to go through to actually pick out what you should be doing there. So that's the reason you have guidance. And also it's, again, very much established in how the UK has done things for many years on lots of things, not just highways, is the UK doesn't tend to prescribe how things are done. So from a highways point of view, DFT will always say it's down to the local highway authority. It's their job to determine what's best for the local people. I think the other issue is if you do go into LTN 120 into a bit of detail, there are tables, there are numbers in there for the engineers that like to try and get a number to feel comfortable with. So it is kind of in place, it's almost a semi-standard. But the problem you have with it is people start cherry picking again. So they'll say, oh, we can just do the minimum thing everywhere. So you have to take a bit of a step back. And again, what's your vision? What you're trying to achieve there? What's your budget? What's the politics? And it's very hard to prescribe that. Perhaps we should be able to.
Thank you. Right, Guy, thanks for waiting.
Hello, thanks for that. It's really interesting. I think one frustration I sometimes feel is I read a lot of guidance, I think that's the right word, from something, imagine something coming from Wheels for Wellbeing, just showing how they think things should be, their vision. And there's all sorts of stuff that I come across like that. But then I'll be talking to highways engineers in the council, and it almost feels like they're really behind the times with their thinking. They're totally ignorant of how the world is moving on. And I was just wondering how fair it is to say that, and to expect them to keep abreast of how the world is shifting, how expectations are shifting, given they're understaffed, they're under budget, they've got people shouting at them from all different sides. Does that make sense?
It does, and it's a really, really good question. So we can probably use a couple of examples. So let's keep it with highways. There is absolutely nothing in law that requires to have a highway engineer with any qualifications whatsoever. That's your starting point. So anybody can pitch up, and in theory, you can go and design, I don't know, a set of traffic calming. From the local authority point of view, hopefully they'll be employing people with at least some experience and qualification in what they're doing. If you're then getting into the professional realm, and this is probably heading towards the consultants. Consultants are competing against each other. They're trying to convince their clients that their staff are competent. So you'll find that the consultants are probably, not all the time, but generally better at getting their staff to keep up with professional development. They'll probably pay some of their professional fees as part of their package. Local authorities tend not to. So when I was a team leader, I worked really hard to make sure the staff did professional development. The authority would not pay people's fees. That was down to the individual. So if you're somebody working for a local authority, and you've got no requirement in your job description or career progression that you have to become an incorporated engineer or a chartered engineer or anything like that, you're not going to do it. So there's probably an issue with the local authority point of view on how can we upskill, how can we actually give the incentives for people to do better. As somebody who's currently a roving consultant, I'm even having to be even more competitive and try and set myself against the crowd there. So that's why I'll be writing about some of the, I'll be talking about cycle infrastructure, not being actual motoring infrastructure, something a bit off the wall for some people. So there's some of us who are interested in some of the emerging themes and how the Dutch are doing it and how the Swedish are doing it. But for a lot of people, they don't have the time, the energy, the resources to do that. If you contrast that with an architect, the term architect is protected in law. You can't call yourself an architect unless you are. Now, I am a chartered engineer, and you can't call yourself that if you're not. So there is that level of protection. But there isn't a requirement, say, if I'm a consultant, I might be getting design signed off by somebody more senior than me. If I'm in a local authority, it depends. Some are really good. Some have really good processes. Some have nothing. You've also got some local authorities where, unfortunately, there are people who have sat there, they've become institutionalized. It's just easy just to plod along and do what you're told. But you do find often that those people stay there when everybody else gets made redundant or moves on, or whatever else. So it is a big problem, and probably explains some of the designs we see out there on the street.
Fascinating insight there, Mark. Before I bring other Mark in, can I just ask you this question from the chat, which from Andy Kay in Wiltshire, which is, do any highways authorities publish their risk assessment methodologies, and do any consider cyclists when examining highways / roads risks?
I doubt if anybody publishes that kind of stuff routinely. If it's been produced, you can discover it through FOI, Freedom of Information. Again, depends on the local authority, I guess. I wouldn't say that kind of stuff is not going to be proactively published.
But is it routinely produced?
Ooh, depends.
Right.
Again,
Okay.
down to the local authority, down to the resources, depends how they're organised, depends how interested senior management are.
Thank you. Mark, other Mark.
It's a Mark double act. So there are a number of professional institutions and bodies which people like Mark and myself are members of: Institute of Civil Engineers, Institute of Highway Engineers, Chartered Institute Highways and Transportation. And to be members of those and to have those letters after your name, you have to do a certain amount of continuous professional development, CPD, and also to be a chartered engineer, and to have other bits in your name, you need to do other bits of qualifications. So I'm not trying to promote ourselves. We teach a course, 4-day course for the Institute of Highway Engineers, which you can get professional registration and certification if you do an extra module on it. And the other bodies also do similar sorts of things. So if you're an engineer that wants to be more competent, you can either do this voluntarily or your employer can make you do it. So we've done 2 in-house courses, and there are others for local authorities. I won't name them because I think that's fair. So your local authority can, be more proactive and train its engineers to do better. Or they can ignore it. And at least if the engineers in the authority are doing better, they'll know when the contractors or the consultants are trying to pull one over on them. So one question would be to ask your local authority, are their engineers and designers competent, and what proof have they have that they're competent?
Now that's a really good question.
Have they been doing these courses or not? We have been talking to ATE. I'll just say one thing, Mark. We have been talking to ATE, and I did talk about this with a couple of senior people at ATE about making a training requirement part of getting the funding from ATE. Yeah. And Chris Boardman said, we want everyone who works on this in the country to be a virtual employee of Active Travel England, even if they don't know they're an employee, because we've only got 100 people working for us, he said, but we want thousands of people working for us, even if they don't think they are. So I'll leave Mark can respond to that bit.
It's a good one. I mean, I would say they who provide the funding call the shots. So yeah, things like that is really good way of actually making people do stuff. A slight counter to asking, are your staff competent? And that's not in a derogatory way. It's a genuine question. I had a freedom of information request come in when I was with a London local authority, and it was asking about the qualifications, academic or professional, of the entire department staff. My answer to that was none of your business. And the reason it was none of their business is because, again, there's no legal requirement for anybody to be qualified. And those of us who were qualified paid our own fees. So it was absolutely nothing to do with the, actually, it was nothing to do with the public. In terms of local authority, the job description would say requires, I don't know, a chartered engineer or somebody with equivalent experience. And that's always the get out clause. I think if the UK wants to start trying to police it a bit more, they could require things to be signed off by people at a certain qualification level, but again, that could be a slippery slope because we have a skill shortage as it is in the industry. So it's a really interesting thing about demonstrating competence. So local authorities, hard to drag out the competence from them. Consultants will tell you everything they do because they're competing for the work. And Mark's just put a link there to the IHE course. Yeah.
Very much enjoying this
some good questions,
mini
really good questions.
Topic that's arose here. Yeah, I'm just going to go right back to the start of the chat. We'll do a couple more questions and we'll wrap up just after 10 past. One from Pearl in London, who asks, do any of the documents that you talked about mandate a footway or cycle lane on every road? If not, why not?
The answer is no. There is no legal requirement for any highway authority to provide any footway, or any footway, carriageway, or cycle track for that matter. But yeah, if you've got a road, there's no requirement for local authority to actually have a footway next to it. The local authority has powers to put those things in, which is either Section 65 or Section 66 of the Highways Act. I can never remember which way around they are. But no, if you've got a village in the countryside and it's just a carriageway through the middle of the village, No, there's no reason or no requirement to provide a footway there.
So I think I will jump in then with a follow-up from another question in the chat from Andy, who asked another question, but I think this is related, which is, therefore, isn't it reality that most of our health and safety laws, standards and guidelines, but particularly these highways laws, have been developed essentially with vehicles in mind?
Yeah, absolutely. The default position in UK highway law is you can do what you like in a vehicle unless you're restricted somehow, whether it's by national legislation. So that could be, the 30 mile an hour default speed limit, or 20 in Wales, or local traffic order, or the local authority uses its powers to go and build something, so traffic calming, or footway, cycle track, stuff like that. But you can drive where you like, how you like, and park where you like, unless otherwise controlled, which is a massively unlevel playing field.
Again, did not know that. Right, Cameron, let's bring you in. We'll get these last two questions in, and then we'll wrap up. Cameron.
Yeah, sorry, it was really good conversation there. Yeah, I'm off mute, aren't I? Good conversation there on qualifications and so on. I just wondered, and I can see some people have posted some stuff, some links and so on, and information, which is great. But I just wondered if we should have a future session on Active Travel Cafe, generally about career pathways into active travel related careers, for anybody who wants to sort of change careers. I don't necessarily just mean, and obviously engineering. That's probably partway through somebody's career is probably quite a difficult thing to get into, but other things, maybe transport planning and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how you'd probably want a few people with different pathways to essentially explain their experience. Yeah, that's a good thing, because I mean, I would describe myself at the moment as a highway engineer who dabbles in transport planning. There's transport planners who dabble in highway engineering. So many diverse ways that people have got there. Some of the best planners and engineers I've met have got geography degrees, believe it or not, as a starting point. So, yeah.
Kicking myself, I didn't go for a geography degree way back when I was deciding that. But
yeah, I once had a technician who was an ex British Transport copper. Right. Absolutely brilliant at dealing with the public. There you go. Right. Diversity of background.
That sounds like a good idea. We'll bank that suggestion. Thanks, Cameron. Ruth, let's make this the last question, unless anyone wants to ask a final one after this. Then we'll wrap up.
Oh, well, it was kind of things spoken about a bit earlier, big bike question, etc., etc. So today, cycling through Hammersmith was a woman. I haven't got a bit. It was a bit like a turn, but it was a mobility scooter. So if you imagine what a turn, TRN, electric bike, long tail bike, is when it's got the rain cover over it, which people use. This was an elderly lady who is disabled in a mobility scooter, using it on cycle paths, bits of quiet road, etc., etc. It seems to me that we really have to have this conversation about what our cycle routes are going to be used for, and that on A roads or fast roads, you must have separated cycle lanes so that people can cycle in whatever bike they're on, be it a cargo bike or that kind of mobility scooter. And then in towns, villages, and quiet places, we give priority to cycling and walking by reducing car space altogether. I know Leon's been going on about that in the thing, and James, from a mobility point of view, we just literally push the cars back so that we allow those on any form of bike I'll use, or mobility scooter, has the right to be there, and not the cars going at anything more than 20 miles an hour. And I thought there was a rule that if it's more than 20 miles an hour and X hundreds or thousands of cars, they have to provide a separated cycle route. They shouldn't be using paint, but I could be wrong. Thank you for letting me feel that.
No rule of law whatsoever. If you go to Local Transport Note 1 of 20, again, LTM 120, there's guidance on the speed limit, stroke speed of traffic, and the volume on what you should provide, or the options that you should provide, but it's not mandated. So a local authority can decide, I'm not going to build anything whatsoever, that's fine. But as soon as they want to go and build something, they should really be looking at the guidance and adjusting their design accordingly.
Can I just say, we wanted to get a rule that did exactly that, Ruth. I was on the steering group for LTM 120, and me and Lucy Marstrand, who's at TfL, and various others tried to get the DFT to do that. And the DFT said, if you're allowed by law to put something that's substandard in, we can't, in the broader legislation, we can't have this directive telling you you can't do it. So that's why the table in there that has the red, amber, green to say it's the red means it's not very good and you should really shouldn't do it, but you are legally allowed to do it. And that was our way of trying to put a very broad hint to people they shouldn't do it, but we were told very strongly that if it's not expressly banned by law, we can't stop local authorities doing it.
Yeah.
So with the new government, hopefully we should all be campaigning that whoever the Transport Ministry is, that this is something that is taken on board.
Well, this was a senior officer rather than a minister, so they would need to be told what to do by the minister.
Yeah.
I want to give the last question to James because he's had his hand up again and I have seen him this time. So James, last question or comment and then we'll wrap up.
Right. So I will keep on toggling between mute and unmute. It's probably more a list of suggestions for follow-up rather than a question, because if I start asking loads of questions, then we're going to be here all night. So response to Cameron, if you're on LinkedIn, then try and find me, or if you're not on LinkedIn, it's worth looking up. There's the Transport Planning Society, definitely one way in. That's a way I looked at, I think, a few years ago. I'm now going down the cartography route, and I think there is definitely some relevance in terms of developing maps which are useful. We had in Birmingham, we had a very good kind of greenways map by someone who's no longer with us, unfortunately, but we definitely could. I think there's this whole idea of people have all these negative things. Oh, I can't cycle because I can't cycle because of this horrid underpass. And if we could just set out a vision and set out a map of what we want our city to be, that's definitely a cartography skill. You don't have, a map doesn't have to be what's there. It can be what it could be there. And yes, as some of you may have been seeing on those of you on Twitter and follow me as Plastic Planners, AI, I don't even know where to start, but you can literally just knock into AI 3 or 4 words, come up with all kinds of stuff. And I think there's enormous potential just to have a scene of somewhere and say, look, this is, especially an old canal, Birmingham, absolutely full of them, this is an old canal that is horrid and muddy and, frankly, nobody wants to go there, any time after about kind of bright midday. But what could it be like? It could be amazing. And these places don't need a lot of money because the structures are already there, and they're grade separated structures. I've never wanted to advocate cycle paths as an alternative to proper bike routes, but when they're appropriate, when they are direct, I don't think there's any more direct route than the Birmingham mainline canal between Birmingham and Wolverhampton. So much could be done. So much could be done with cheap lighting. I'm not sure where lighting fits in as an institute. I have a school friend who runs, I think he builds solar powered lighting. Probably that was the old joke at school, what's the definition of something pointless, solar powered street light? And that actually, it makes total sense because the solar panels charge the battery and you can install them anywhere. And the amount of energy you need, I don't know if you know Cannon Hill Park in Birmingham, they've got these tiny little studs, but they're the difference that the social difference, the social improvement, the improvement in social safety you get from the tiniest of studs is massive. And then if you look at some of the cycle paths around Warwick University, they've got, I think, lighting stands that are about 1 metre high. Again, that's such an improvement compared to not having any at all. Where does that come from?
Thank you, James. Thank you. We better
Okay.
there. No, so offer to look James up on LinkedIn for and we
LinkedIn or Twitter as Plastic Planners.
And we've banked the idea of sort of something on future careers as well. Right, thank you everyone, and apologies for our speaker. On his behalf, we will definitely work to get Roger back on a future session. And a quick taste of what we've got coming up over the next few weeks. We've got next week Nicola Pastor from Solve the School Run. They've launched a really interesting tool, which she will be talking about. After that, we've got Sarah McGonigal, who's the Head of External Affairs for Cycling UK. Very interesting time to hear from her during the election period. Then we've got Ian Greenwood on the politics of road death. We've got Eleanor Rofe, Harry Larrington Spencer from University of Westminster on some really interesting new research, which assesses all recent research on active travel measures and tells us what the most successful interventions are. And we've got Laura Laker, who the well-known journalist and author. So hopefully that's a taste of what's to come. Thank you to Mark Philpott for filling in at very short notice, and for all the discussions that popped up during the session today. Really interesting. Thanks, everyone. See you next week.